Thanks all for coming, first of all. And to begin with, I was kidnapped by the Israeli military on the 7th of February this year during an illegal night raid operation on the ISN's media office in Ramallah. 36 hours later I was released, and in every interview that followed with journalists, I really struggled to try and turn attention from what had happened to me as an international activist onto how it reflects what Palestinians go through every single day. This is the nature of our work. We travel to Palestine to stand in solidarity with the people there. We go to their demonstrations. We go to their land to defend it like it was our own. But at the end of the day, we can always leave. And yes, our work may bring us to places of danger if their work is a little bit stressful, but it's really nothing compared to what these people go through, people whose only crime was to be born in Palestine. And many people often ask me, what is it that brings us to Palestine in the first place, when there's a whole world of injustices to pick and choose from, including enough in my own country, in Australia, of course. And for me, it's always felt as though Israel and Palestine have become almost a symbol for forces that we're seeking to eradicate worldwide. Whether it's fascism, racism, neo-colonialism, state-sponsored terrorism, the list goes on. They're all things that we see there, and it's something about Israel I feel this strikes a very deep note for us, coming from the West. On the surface, it really appears to be a society not entirely unlike our own. It's Western, it's capitalist, it's cosmopolitan, and its citizens are also witting or unwitting collaborators to war crimes. So I arrived in Palestine. It was almost exactly a year ago, at the beginning of Ramadan, and one of the first activities I did with the ISM was to attend a demonstration in the West Bank. It was in the small West Bank village of Barin. It's just south of Nablus. And what we're looking at here is some of the contested farmland that belongs to the people of Barin, but have become almost impossible to reach due to the illegal Israeli settlement of Bracha, which was built on the lands of Barin in 1982. Now, when Bracha was originally built, it was built as a military base, and then it was demilitarized, if you like, several years later for the transfer of a civilian population, which, as we all know, is illegal under the Fourth Geneva Convention. And what the people of Barin began to witness in the last 2 or 3 years was a very significant increase in the residents of Bracha actually coming down to attack the residents of Barin each time that they tried to access their farmland. It became almost impossible to fulfill this daily task of going out to harvest your crops, to take care of your land, when each time they were intercepted by either violent armed Israeli settlers or the Israeli military, who were providing full support to the settlers. And the demonstrations began in January last year, really just as a means of voicing their frustration with what seemed to have become almost an impossible situation. That first demonstration that I went to in Barin, it was entirely unlike any demonstration that I've ever been to in Australia. You felt the tension in the air as soon as we began to march down through this valley, up the hill towards the contested farmland. And I felt a lump rise in the back of my throat as, coming further up the hill, a line of Israeli soldiers appeared on top of that hill, all pointing their M16s at the crowd. And my first instinct on that day was probably to turn around and run in the other direction. But I took my strength from the Palestinians, who They go out to face these soldiers week in, week out, merely to try and reach their farmland. Now, the Israeli military will like to define these kinds of demonstrations as violent riots or war zones. They do this because this definition then gives them full impunity for any kind of action that they may take during the demonstrations, any weapons that they may use, and any injuries or deaths that may occur as a result. Now, my take has always been that for the Palestinians who have lived through 62 years of entirely violent occupation and counting, they have been shot, bombed, killed, tortured, ethnically cleansed, collectively punished, driven out. They've showed incredible restraint in the kinds of resistance that they've engaged in. And for a young Palestinian boy to do what we will see so often at these demonstrations, to do the symbolic act of taking up a stone to throw at his oppressor, it is simply that, a symbolic act. Photographs like this from the First Intifada, the extremely iconic photographs when the Palestinian people really started engaging in this kind of resistance en masse. I think one of the interesting points about this is that it's also the same time, at the beginning of the First Intifada in 1987, when the occupation inside the occupied territory stopped being quite so profitable for Israel. This is as a direct result of Palestinian resistance. The Israeli state began losing money on the occupation because suddenly they had to start pumping a lot more money into ensuring that there were more soldiers in the area, that those soldiers were sufficiently armed to keep their stronghold over the resources that they're stolen from the Palestinians. And it's the same kind of resistance that we see happening every week in demonstrations around the West Bank. So I returned to that demonstration in Iraq-Barin almost every week. And what the villagers of Iraq-Barin began doing was holding the demonstration. They moved it from the traditional day of Friday to Saturday, which is actually the Jewish holiday, the Jewish holy day of Shabbat. It begins sundown on Friday until sundown on Saturday. And this is due to the fact that what the settlers of Bracha were actually doing each Saturday was taking this as cause to come down and attack the people of Iraq-Barin. I don't know what part of the Torah says, thou shalt go down and attack the local Palestinians on your holy day, but it was happening every week. And it's not just in Iraq-Barin, the phenomena of settlers taking the law into their own hands on their holy day. We saw it happening entirely around the West Bank. It really was the busiest busiest day of the week, if you like, particularly for me working in the Nablus area. We would wait for calls to come in from maybe 20 or 30 different villages with farmers or contacts or families calling in to say that perhaps some of their sheep had been stolen by settlers when they'd taken their sheep out to walk. Perhaps someone had set fire to their olive trees. Perhaps someone had been shot. The attacks on the olive trees were really particularly shocking, given the fact that for so many people it is a holy land. And it really made me question how the settlers could see this as a holy land if they were able to so readily set fire to it. This was when it happened one day in Iraq-Barin, and because it was usually quite difficult to get the fire truck to come down, either to make it through checkpoints or to make it through the blockades that the Israeli soldiers would impose on the roads. We had no choice but to grab other olive branches to try and put these huge flames out because there was no water to be had. And as I said, the settler violence in the region, we really began to see it surge. Like the villagers would tell us about 2 or 3 years ago really marked the turning point where it became such a daily part of their lives. And it became a very daily part of my life as well. It's difficult to pull up a single example or two to try and illustrate this for people, what it was like living under this kind of thing. But one of the attacks that stick in my mind most clearly is from December last year. In the Palestinian village of Yusuf, just south of Nablus, settlers from the neighboring settlement of Tahor broke into the mosque in the early hours of the morning. Now, as you can see in this photograph, they poured petrol across the carpet of the mosque and then set fire to it. They burnt over 80 copies of the Quran and other holy texts, and no settlers were ever arrested or investigated in relation to this attack, despite the fact that it was blatantly obvious where they had come from. The settlement was a mere 500 meters away. And if we just pause to think, what would happen if Palestinians instigated a similar kind of attack on an Israeli target? Imagine the outcry, imagine the backlash inside of Israel, and imagine what would be done to any Palestinians living in that area, whether they had been involved in it or not. Take, for example, what happened during the 2005 Gaza disengagement, when the few remaining synagogues inside Gaza were bulldozed by the Palestinian Authority. When the settlers were removed from the area, it was mutiny inside of Israel. It was a huge outcry, whereas this featured very, very minimally in the Israeli press. Moving on to the neighboring village of Barin. Barin is a village just south of Nablus, and Barin sits in a very, very dangerous area. It's actually in a valley in between two of the most violent, ideologically extreme settlements in the north of the West Bank, Yitzhak and Bracha, and Barin really bears the brunt of their attacks. And in July of 2008, the settlers of Yitzhak and Bracha actually began firing homemade rockets onto the people of Barin. As you can see in this photograph, the rockets began as small canisters, and then as the technology progressed, they eventually reached the size of about a 3-liter bottle. These rockets fell in the gardens and homes of the people living in Barin, in the local primary school. Once again, no one was ever arrested or investigated in relation to these attacks. And it's incredible. If we try to tune into any single article in the corporate media about Israel or Palestine, it's become almost impossible to not hear about the rocket attacks that are being fired from Gaza onto southern Israeli cities, whereas almost nobody knows about what you could call terrorist attacks being initiated by Israeli settlers in the West Bank, not just in the West Bank, in other areas too, inflicted on Palestinian targets. And these two particular attacks are two of the worst examples of what has come to be known as the price tag campaign. It's a campaign cooked up by some of the most extreme Israeli settlers. It's a political campaign enacted through violent means. Essentially what it is when they feel that the Israeli government makes any kind of concession to the Palestinian cause, whether it's evacuating an illegal settlement outpost or placing a construction freeze or ban on the settlement construction for a period of time, the settlers will strike back violently, not at Israeli targets, but at Palestinian targets, to send a message to their own government saying, we're not going to stand for this. Now, while the settlers are used as a human enforcement of Israel's matrix of control inside the West Bank, obviously it's to try and consolidate the land grabs that they've been making. It's not just happening inside the West Bank. We can see it happening inside of Israel as well. First of all, inside of Israel, apartheid is enforced in pretty much exactly the same way on the 5.6 million Jewish citizens of Israel and the 1.3 million Palestinian citizens that hold Israeli citizenship. Now what we're looking at here is actually a wall built between the Palestinian side and the Jewish side of the Israeli city of Lid. It's one of the 6 so-called ethnically mixed cities inside of Israel. And there's actually an apartheid wall built between the two peoples inside of Israel. It's actually one of 3 cities inside of Israel where we can see this happening. Now, while the Israeli municipality in the area has claimed that this is for noise control, it's quite obvious that it's far more likely to be for population control, to keep the Palestinian people shunted into a much smaller area with access to much less resources, and to simply try and tackle what Israel has termed the demographic threat, the rapidly expanding Palestinian population inside of Israel, while they would like to see them obviously not outnumber the Jewish citizens living inside of Israel. And this is actually a photo from the Nazareth region. It's in the Galilee, which is the area in the north of Israel that has the highest concentration of Palestinian citizens of Israel. It's an area that pretty much every successive Israeli government has really tried to break up and dramatically change the demographic makeup of, enraged by the fact that there is what they would deem an Arab stronghold still remaining in Israel. So settlement projects, if you would like to call them that, I do. Settlement projects began in this area of Israel in 1950, using the land that was annexed via the extremely racist absentee property law, which was incepted in the same year. The absentee property law essentially states that all land that was abandoned by the Palestinian refugees that took flight in 1948, that land now becomes property of the State of Israel, and the State of Israel will then turn that land over to Jewish citizens for building new homes, etc., etc. And this is the law that has enabled the takeover and annexation of vast tracts of land inside of Israel, and the proliferation of apartheid inside the country. And this photo is actually of the exclusive Jewish colony, Nazareth Elite, that was built on the stolen lands of the Palestinian city of Nazareth. Now, while the Palestinian citizens of Nazareth, they have very little access to basic services like healthcare, education, etc., etc., all of the municipality's funding goes to the Jewish city of Nazareth Elite. Since the municipality of the 2 areas was merged into one, it's become very difficult for the people of Nazareth to access any kind of basic services and assert their rights as so-called citizens of this country in any way. And I think what's interesting about it is that when you look at this photograph, it really looks like we're looking at the West Bank. You see the same ubiquitous red roofs of the West Bank settlements, and it seems like exactly the same kind of behavior that we see happening inside the occupied territories is what's happening inside of Israel. This is a photograph from some of the kids from the Bedouin village of Al-Adakiv in the Negev, the desert in the south of Israel. And this was a village that I was lucky enough to be able to spend some time in earlier this year. What it is to be living in an unrecognized village in the Negev, it essentially means that while you are a citizen of Israel and you pay taxes to the state does not recognize your village. There are several dozen of these villages located inside the Negev, with approximately 110,000 Bedouins, or Palestinian Bedouins, living in this area, who are citizens of the state, but receive no recognition from the state at all. They have no access